Well, good evening, folks. Good evening, good evening, good evening. It is February 17th, and I am one of your co hosts for this weekly broadcast that we call Ignite, which is a weekly faith based conversation to provoke and cultivate faith and human potential. And I'm so glad to be back with you. It has been a full day for me, not only dealing with this heavy snow we got, which I love. I know the folks of Wichita are sick of. Sometimes I think they're used to it, but if you come from the deep south or the southwest, where it snowed like twice in every 25 years, once every 25 years, we saw snow that lasted like 2 hours and it would melt. Uh, like to see snow like 6 inches, and it's just like it's like exciting for some of us. So with the snow, Kifa, Kansas Interfaith Action, is engaged in our advocacy week. As a matter of fact, I am missing the final vigil of advocacy week that's going on right now. So that, and then very excited to announce our publisher Invite Resources unveiled the book, a book that I have coming out called Jesus Unchained. The cover was revealed, and the title, and you can start pre-ordering. We'll say more about that later, but I'm of course super excited about the book. My prayer is that the book will help us to engage, to reconstruct. So I know there's a lot of stuff going on. Kai and Kyle, you all's generation, y'all folks are engaged in the work of what they call deconstruction. But you know what, I don't, this book is not no so much, we do some deconstruction, but I'm really trying to reconstruct an interpretation of the faith that speaks to all of us, that that attempts to transcend our racial divisions, our political divisions, our nationalisms, our cultural wars, and speaks to a reality, a Jesus that cultivates the full humanity of all people. So that's what the book is about in a nutshell. That's a horrible statement. I should know how to. I should have a cover sentence for the book that comes across better than that. But we'll say more about it later. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching, please reach out and share this broadcast with some of your family and friends. We're going to have an amazing conversation tonight. You know that St. Mark here at St. Mark, we've been in a series called Lift Every Voice, taken from the National Negro Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And what we're doing this month is using Black History Month as an opportunity to lift up voices that have been silenced or ignored or repressed, suppressed in our history as a nation, both voices of faith as well as African American voices. And so we're going to have an amazing time tonight. We have someone who is uniquely gifted and equipped to do that. And we will introduce him in just a second. Let me bring on my co-host. Look, tag some. Can you tag folks now? Tag folks. You can't do watch parties. It's watch parties. You can't do watch parties, but you can share, and you can like type people's name in and tag them and invite them to come and watch the video with you. And then we want you to be engaged in this conversation. And I want to say this, and then before we bring on our co-host, I especially want you to engage in this conversation with us if you feel like you are a person whose voice has been silenced. One of the things I hope that we'll do tonight is show you how to unsilence your own voice, whether that be in your relationships, your family, in your community, how to unsilence your own voice and become a voice on behalf of what's right and on behalf of people who do not have voices. So let me bring on our co-host, of course, our associate pastor at St. Mark United Methodist Church, Pastor Yolanda Oliver. Good evening, Pastor. How are you?
Good evening. I just want to say I felt some type of way missing Wednesday night. I'm excited that it's Thursday night, but last night I felt a little type of way in my spirit that I didn't get to see you guys. So I'm happy that we are here together. I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited about your book release. You labored long, and I think it's a dream come true for you. So I'm just so excited that it's coming to fruition.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And although you felt weird last night, you survived. That's a message to folks. No matter how weird the moment may feel, if Kai was on, I'll let him hoop this. Kai, do you hoop when you preach?
He's not even going. He's not going to go there with you. He's not even going to go there with you. Blake's there.
And you're not frozen. Unfreeze. Unfreeze. You are
I'm not engaging in foolishness in honor of Black History Month. So,
welcome, sir. Thank you for being on. How are you?
I'm lovely. I didn't get the memo. When we went live, I noticed your sweater, and all I thought was, "Oh, how I want to be in the number when the Saints go marching."
Hey, as a matter of fact, I was on a meeting with Lynn Wilson today, and he said first thing he noticed when we got on the meeting, he got a new turtleneck, and he says when we do your live webinar, you've got to wear the turtleneck. And Kai has to come on with us with his turtleneck.
We're gonna talk to Linda and the girls.
Hey, leave my turtleneck
alone. And we're gonna get
alone.
Some adjustments made to the wardrobe budget.
Alone. No, this is a good thing. I like it. More turtlenecks.
Leave my turtleneck alone, please. Pastor Kyle, good evening, sir. How are you?
Where's your turtleneck, Pastor Kyle?
There we go. Still no turtleneck. I've got my sweatshirt though. I am in full. I had to stay home because of snow and kids in having no school mode. So this is casual Thursday for me.
No turtlenecks.
No turtlenecks.
No turtlenecks.
Just enjoying a nice sweatshirt.
And of course, our special guest for tonight. Let's bring him on and welcome him to Ignite.
I am so excited.
Yes,
Dr.
Robert Weems. Yes. How do you do that deal, Yolanda, where you make his picture big and make Kai small?
I really thought you were asking me to do something, and I was gonna fall for it, Dr. Weems. But you see the foolery that I have to put up with.
And I didn't wear a turtleneck either, so that
I was gonna let you slide on that one, but I'm so glad you participated.
I love it. Yolanda, introduce. You've known Dr. Weems longer than I have, and would you present him, and then
with pleasure. Dr. Weems is one of the most brilliant men that I've had the opportunity to engage with. He comes to Wichita State as the new Willard Garvey Distinguished Professor of Business. He is a recipient of numerous fellowships and grants. He is published. If you want to know something, if you want to know, not if you just want to be curious about something, I haven't really been able to listen to him speak about something that he wasn't well versed in. I had the privilege of being at his wedding, and I believe it was one of your nephews who said, "I thought that Uncle Robert just never wanted to graduate." I didn't realize how vast his knowledge was. I didn't realize that he was published. Do you remember when I'm talking about Dr. Weems? And he just went on to talk about how proud he is of his Uncle Robert. He is a magnificent man of Alpha Phi Alpha. So I know that Kai and Pastor Robert are excited about that. And he also happens to be married to a beautiful woman of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. They have a beautiful family, and he is a proud, I'm going to call him a Wichita native. You've been here long enough for you to call this home. So we're glad to have you this evening.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, Dr. Weems, before we get into our conversation, by the way, folks, we're going to spend some time doing this tonight. We're going to take time, and Dr. Weems is going to lift up 4 to 5 voices from American history, from Black history, that have traditionally been suppressed, silenced, or ignored. So hopefully we all know, usually what happens, Pastor Kyle, is we talk about Black history, and we talk about Harriet Tubman, we're as bad as the school system. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and now Barack Obama, as if those are the only 4 Black people that have ever really contributed anything. And so part of what we're doing in this series is lifting up some unique, some voices people have never heard before, or showing you a different dimension of someone that you think already know well. So Dr. Weems, welcome. Take a moment, sir, and tell folks, before we get into the history discussion, tell folks the story of Robert Weems and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, again, it's my pleasure to be here this evening. My story begins in Chicago, Illinois. I was quite frankly, the primary motivation or encouragement I got early on that permits me to be here in this position at this exact moment were my parents. My parents, made a real point of investing in both me and my 2 younger sisters' education that, again, allowed me to early on have significant access to books around the house. And that sort of love of reading was something that, I carry with me to this day. In terms of sort of my sort of path to Wichita, I did my undergraduate work majoring in history and minoring in Black studies at Western Illinois University. I have 1 master's degree in African American studies that I received from Boston University, and that was a great opportunity because part of that program included what they called a practicum component. And myself and a colleague had the opportunity to do research in Liberia, West Africa, where we did a history of the labor movement in that African country. I spent some time living in Milwaukee. Sometimes in life is very interesting that, and looking at my own trajectory, I never really thought that I would teach high school, but I found myself, in fact, teaching high school when I lived in Milwaukee and attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and got a master's degree in history there. Because among other things, teaching high school helped me to better appreciate how good college professors have it in terms of, the work environment and not having to deal with unruly students in the classroom. And I got my PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And at Madison, and this is the case when you're working on a PhD, the dissertation topic that you decide upon is something that will pretty much influence your ensuing research career. And being from Chicago, I knew I wanted to do something on the history of Chicago's African American community. And for me, it came down to either something on the political development of that community or the economic and business development of that community. And literally one of the best professional and personal decisions I've made in my life, I chose to do something on the economic history of Black Chicago. My dissertation, and which I revised into my first book, was on the history of an African American insurance company, Black company in Chicago that no longer is in existence. And from there, I've done books on a variety of subjects. I did a book related to African American consumerism. I did a book related to sort of the historic relationship between Black entrepreneurs and the federal government. And my latest works, in fact, have had a refocus on Chicago. A couple years ago, myself and a colleague did an edited book that included a variety of contributors looking at various aspects of Black history in Chicago, Black business history in Chicago. And my latest book was a biography of Anthony Overton, who was a very prominent African-American entrepreneur in Chicago. And quite frankly, the visibility that I was able to get working in an understudied field, and I'm talking about African-American business history, helped me, in fact, to get the Garvey Distinguished Professorship of Business History here at Wichita State. And since I've been in Wichita, you know, in terms of business-related activities, one of the things I did was to gather information about local African-American entrepreneurship. I interviewed a variety of local entrepreneurs, and those audio interviews and transcripts, I subsequently donated them to ABLA Library
Wow.
at Wichita State University. And these remain, you know, resources for students and others to get information about this component of local Wichita history. And an offshoot of my, you know, what I call the Wichita African American Business History Project, one of the local organizations I've been involved with for several years is the Heartland Wichita Black Chamber of Commerce, and I've been on their board for several years. And again, an offshoot of the Wichita African American Business History Project was my establishment, with the, you know, consultation of my colleagues on the board, establishing the Wichita Black Business Hall of Fame. In fact, we inducted our first persons into the Hall of Fame in 2016, and over the past years, we've continued to install people into the Wichita Black Business Hall of Fame. And one thing that I'm proud about this, and this is something my wife reminds me about a lot, is that this gives an opportunity to honor people who normally would not be honored, in terms of, you know, African-American business people who've made important contributions. And a couple other things in terms of, you know, how I got to this moment, and based upon my interest in African-American business history. In 2019, I was a historical consultant and appeared in the documentary Boss, the History of Black Business in America, which premiered on PBS. And in fact, this past summer, in June of 2021, I was a keynote speaker for that looked at, they had a broad-based series on racism in the U.S. economy, and I played a keynote role in the part of the series that dealt with, you know, entrepreneurship. But again, to sum it all up, again, if I have one primary reason as to why I'm here, above and beyond, you know, the gifts that God gave me, it goes back to, again, you know, the investment and love that my parents, and, you know, put in me and my sisters.
Awesome. As a matter of fact, and let's see. As a matter of fact, I just think that's a great place to encourage parents who are listening, grandparents as well, the importance of pouring into your children the things that matter and the values you have, and knowing that they will eventually benefit from it. And so that's a I appreciate you saying, you know, when we talk about the Black community, and we're talking about the roots and history, that history begins within our families, and strong families produce great individuals. And so we appreciate you saying that. I think Kyle has a question that we're gonna get in, and then we'll be ready to turn towards our history.
Does Kai or Kyle have a question? Because I do have a question. I'm actually wondering, because this isn't part of our question stuff, but Um, in terms of like education, when you were growing up, was that normative in your family, or was that something? In what ways did your parents kind of instill that pursuit of higher education for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, neither of my parents were college graduates, but back in the day, if you had a high school diploma from a solid uh, high school, that gave you a very good educational background in its own right. But like a lot of parents, uh, my parents, they wanted to, create a situation where, in fact, their children could go to college. And interestingly enough, in my own sort of career, and it's kind of funny when I share this story because people see me as Professor Weems, and I have a certain persona, if you will. But when I was a youngster, in the early elementary school, I went to Chicago public school. And at the end of fourth grade, I had been labeled, this incorrigible young man who, the only option they had me was sort of toned down version of reform school. And they told my parents, well, maybe the Catholics might be able to straighten them out. And again, in terms of investment, my parents invested in me and my sister to go to Catholic school. And in a very real sense, that was very positive in terms of my perspective. Another part of my background that, helped me sort of navigate the streets of Chicago, which were quite interesting when I was growing up on the South Side, was that I learned how to play basketball in Catholic school. And that was something that I did in high school as well as college. And that was, again, something that was helpful. But again, it was, going back to your question, in high school, even before I went to college, I had a sense of confidence that yeah, I could go to college above and beyond being an athlete and succeed academically.
Hmm.
Wow.
Great.
I was going to say, guys, kind of keeping in that vein, talking about, you had this confidence instilled in you, right? This sense of identity, the sense of being. Now as you've kind of continued to find success throughout life, is there any particular, like, maybe quote or scripture or just anything that you have read along the way that really reinforces that, or that acts as like a just an inspiration to you? Any word of wisdom that you would give to anybody just that's trying to find their way?
So one scripture that I turn to continuously for inspiration and solace and strength is, Psalms 34, the fourth verse, which says, I sought the Lord and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. Because in life, we have a variety of challenges that we have to deal with. And this particular scripture is something that we could look at it on a variety of levels. But again, in going to the Creator for instruction, for solace, or for whatever, for me, that has been something that has helped me make it through a lot of, tough times and challenging times that I've had in my life.
Hmm.
Yolanda, do you have a question you want to get in before we turn to the question? Turn to
No.
the history.
You know what? Can I just share a brief moment? I am learning that I am aging. I cannot multitask as well as I was. It took me just probably 30 seconds long. Pastor Johnson, see, it be your own people, is what my son says. It be your own people. But it took me 30 seconds longer to get that scripture up than I expected it to. But it's up there. And I think that is a solid scripture for people to put into their repertoire, for you to add that on, that I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all of my fears. And I think right now, Dr. Wing, working on a college campus, one of the Wichita State is going through tremendous changes right now. What are you seeing on campus with our Black and Brown students as far as their commitment to furthering their education? Are you seeing that? When I think about Black history, it used to be we were fighting to have an education. We were fighting for the opportunity to read and to write. Nowadays, it seems as if we're struggling to force our students to want to read and to write, not to just Google something and have surface knowledge, but to truly be to master their learning. What are you seeing on campus with our marginalized students now?
Well, when we look at college campuses, and Wichita State is obviously representative of that, you know, African American students who make it to the collegiate level, for the most part, have a motivation to, in fact, want to learn more. Because, for instance, the courses I teach at Wichita State, above and beyond business related stuff, are African American history courses. And I get a good cross section of students, in those courses. But I tell you, I mentioned earlier that early in my career, I taught on the high school level. And to me, that's the area that is really frightening in terms of, African American, educational activity, because for a variety of reasons. And this is something that I saw back in the day, and it's something that sadly still continues, is that in the minds of some young African Americans, especially on the high school level, there's this notion that, doing good in school is, you're trying to act white. And to me, when I to high school audiences, I really make the point that when we look at our real history of, getting an education or wanting to get an education is the blackest thing you can do. When we look at those schools that were established in the period immediately following slavery, you had students from the ages of 5 to 95 in these schools, because again, people saw the importance of education, among other things, because that was something the slave owners had consciously kept from the enslaved population. So again, a long-winded answer to your question, that on the collegiate level, from my own observations, is less of an issue of people, not, wanting to, get that particular knowledge in Black history or any type of knowledge. But on the high school level, it continues to be a problem where a lot of young people, have this notion that doing good in school, in fact, is some manifestation of trying to act white or be white, which to me, from the context of history and being a historian, is just insane.
Absolutely. Great response. So let's move. And Dr. Weems, I don't know if you need to maybe check your internet connection out. There's occasional freezing on mine. Do you all see that as well?
There's a little delay.
There's a little delay, and just check that. But let's move into our actual formal presentation, or the core of our conversation tonight. And let's talk about 4 to 5 people that you like to identify for us, whose voices in history have been silenced or overlooked or ignored. Let's dig into it.
Okay. As my primary research area in terms of African American history is African American business history. And the first person I want to mention is, in fact, one of my heroes in terms of looking at history. Because one thing about being a historian, when you really look at sort of who people really are, because a lot of times we have sort of historical images of people and who really are the coincide. But the person that I want to mention is someone that, again, is one of my heroes in the context of studying history. And this is a name that most of the audience may not have heard of before. And this individual's name was James Forten. James Forten was arguably the wealthiest American in the early 19th century in the United States. Forten was based in Philadelphia. He was a sail maker by trade, and he owned a sail making factory. But Forten made his fortune in developing advice that made the handling of sails easier. We know even to this day, with sailboats, you have to, sort of move or manipulate the sails a certain way in order to steer the, sailboats. And Thornton came up with a device in the early 19th century that made the handling of sails that much easier. And in the process, he made a literal fortune. At his peak, Fortune was worth more than $300,000. And in today's money, we would definitely add, a few more zeros behind that 300,000. But interestingly enough, when Fortin passed, his estate was valued at $66,000. And the discrepancy between the $300,000 that he had earned during his career and the $66,000 that was in his estate when he passed was the fact that Fortin literally spent most of his fortune to, in fact, buy enslaved African Americans and then set them free.
Wow.
We know that.
Come through. I got nervous for a minute there.
Again, and when we look at business history, whether it's African American business history or American business history, there's this whole notion of social responsibility that, the best business entities also are those entities that have real important ties to the community in a variety of charitable and social uplift activities. And James Fortin from the beginning was someone that, again, sort of epitomized this notion of social responsibility, where he literally gave most of his fortune to, in fact, purchase enslaved people and then set them free.
Wow. All right. Feedback from
Awesome investment.
Yolanda.
Awesome investment.
What time frame was he living in? Or what years was he?
He lived, the peak of his financial career was in the late 1700s and the early 1800s.
Yeah,
and again, at the time, he was regarded as the richest African American in the United States.
Wow. Wow. But go ahead, Kai. I have a comment on this.
No, go ahead, Robert.
Well, I was just going to say that I appreciate one of the things that I'm hoping that folks are hearing as Dr. Weems tells his story is how he created wealth, but then he used wealth to help set other Black folks free, to improve the destiny of other people. It's about reaching back. And it's amazing. All the people in our history that we do know about who made significant contributions were all self-sacrificing people.
Great point. Yes.
They didn't just climb the mountain and say to hell with everybody else. And yet that was an intentional hell because I needed to make it stick. They didn't just climb the mountain and say to hell with everyone else. They turned back and used the resources that they had aggregated and use that to help other people. So that's just one little dimension to this story of James Fortin that's so important. Kai, yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just kind of along the same lines you're on. Number one, like one thing we hear a lot now is this idea of like buy back the block,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and ideas like that. And so, and then the second part of this, from a Christian standpoint, the other thing I want to highlight is that I think that oftentimes somewhere in the road, we feel like as Christians to earn money is bad.
Yes.
And I think that you touched on it, but the idea, I think we forget it's a trajectory, right? So if you're a Christian, you're developing, you're learning, you're exploring your gifts and graces, you come into success, you go through a period where you begin to understand how to steward and manage what you have better. And I think it's the back end that we don't realize is that finding creative, innovative ways to give back to our community. So the problem isn't necessarily hoarding up riches for yourself, but it's never growing to share those riches with your community, right? So God does allow us to be successful, but it's about expanding your mindset on what it looks like to actually distribute that blessing and not just get the blessing, right? Yeah.
Great point, Kai.
Great point. Yolanda, you want to jump in?
I'm just excited to hear a name. This is an awesome idea, Pastor Johnson. So two shouts out for you. Automatically tonight, I've already been enriched. James Fortin, not Thornton. Thank you for correcting that, because I was on the same path you were. But I also just quickly did a little brief. Not only was he economically savvy, but he was an avid author and opposed a bill as a colored man also. So awesome thing to add to the mind.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I've got a Dr. Weems, I think you will appreciate this. I was listening to a podcast from a favorite pastor of mine, and his most recent sermon, he preached from Ecclesiastes 9, chapter 9, verses 13 through 15. And that scripture says, I also saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. I love that. And of course, what this guy does with it is amazing. But it's just what I like about that scripture in connection with James Fortin is that one person acting wisely was able to help so many other people. And even at that early on in in American history, changed the perception of how people viewed the capacity and intelligence and wisdom of African Americans. Great start. Great start. All right. Number 2, let's go. Let's go to next.
In fact, number 2 and number 3 are interconnected in a way, but just to provide a little additional context, especially in the realm of bringing people to light that have been sort of, have suffered from what I would call undeserved obscurity in terms of historical appreciation. And just sort of fast forwarding in our history, at the end of Reconstruction, we know that African Americans found themselves, in a very bad situation. We saw, the rise of Jim Crow laws, and we saw, the Black community pretty much being forced back into a modified form of enslavement. And it was in this particular reality that we saw 2 African American voices emerge in terms of how Black people should respond to this situation. And these are voices that are not obscure. One of these voices was Booker T. Washington, who pretty
Yes.
much said, African Americans should, in this particular context, focus on building an economic base, with the belief that as time went on, that, political rights and other things would naturally come to African Americans. And the other voice, at this particular moment, and it was a competing voice, was the voice of Dr. W. Boyd, who
Yes.
himself was a proponent of Black business development, but at the same time, he argued that African Americans should have access to every right and privilege that other American citizens have, because as of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, African Americans were in fact citizens of this country. But again, to add some additional context to this, this was more than just a two-way debate in terms of how African Americans should respond to the decline and disappearance of Reconstruction. In fact, it was more of a four-way debate. And I want to focus on two other individuals that were major players during this period who had important things to say, but oftentimes have been overlooked. And the first person in this regard was an individual by the name of Timothy Thomas Fortune. Timothy Thomas Fortune was a noted Black journalist in the late 19th century. He was the editor of the New York Age, which was a prominent newspaper in this period. But also in 1884, he wrote a very important book entitled, that looked at, and I'm, as fate would have it, I'm blanking on the title, Black and White, Land, Labor, and Politics in the South. And Fortune, in this book, Black and White, put forward what we might call a class analysis of the racial reality of the late 19th century. Fortune made the point in looking at what was going on in the South that not only were Black people oppressed, but also poor whites were oppressed by the ex-slave owning, oligarchy that pretty much controlled, the region's economy and the like. And T. Thomas Fortune, in his work Black and White, put forward what we might call today a sort of democratic socialist solution to America's racial problem, which again he couched in class terms. And quite frankly, while a lot of people have not heard of T. Thomas Fortune and his 1884 book Black and White, people have heard of the populist movement, which, when we look at the late 19th century, really derived a lot of its ideology and viewpoints from what T. Thomas Fortune had to say in Black and White. And to this day, when we look at sort of this democratic socialist or class analysis of America, and as it relates to race relations, arguably the most important contemporary proponent of that is Dr. Reverend Cornel West.
That's right.
So again, T. Thomas Fortune is someone that was part of this discussion in terms of how Blacks should respond to the failure of Reconstruction, but for a variety of reasons, he has not been recognized.
So you're saying, so I just want to make sure I hear that right, that we usually, the debate or whatever, the differences of opinion, that generally we talk about Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, but you're saying there was a third voice, the voice of this gentleman that you just spoke about.
And there was a fourth voice that I'm going to talk about as well.
Okay, go ahead.
T. Thomas Fortune, in fact, T. Thomas Fortune, in fact, argued that while, race was a part of it, it was also an issue of class. And I would argue, too, to add more perspective to what T. Thomas Fortune had to say, was that the Jim Crow laws that were established in the South during this period, I think were aimed more at poor whites than they were to Blacks, because they gave poor whites in the South what I would call a false sense of status from an economic realm.
Yeah.
because you had a lot of poor whites who were sharecroppers, just like black people were in the post-Reconstruction South. But at least poor whites, they could say, well, yeah, I might be poor, I might be uneducated, but at least I'm not black.
Right.
What T. Thomas Fortune was saying in Black and White, and what the populist movement tried to put forward, was that when we look beyond the issue of race and look at, the class structure of the South, poor whites and the ex-enslaved population pretty much found themselves in the same economic boat. And it would be in the class interest of both poor white and the ex-enslaved population to come together to, in fact, fight for their own mutual class interests, which would indeed to be in conflict or to attack, the wealthy autocrats of the South, most of whom, if not all of whom, were the ex-slave holding, oligarchs.
Wow. So, and I want to put the pictures up. So first of all, I want to put that picture up. That's a picture. And when I typed in Booker T. Washington, it immediately pulled up the picture of him with W.B. Du Bois. That's Du Bois on the left, Washington on the right. And so they are so closely associated because of their different perspectives on how African Americans should approach their journey forward. And then we get this gentleman along with them, J. Thomas Fortune. All right. And the fourth?
T. Thomas Fortune. Can I just give a little modern day comment? So I love this period. There's a new film, a new series on HBO called The Gilded Age. So I thought that T. Thomas Fortune was just a character. You just enlightened me that he really exists. So he is a prominent figure, and his newspaper, one of the first people on the series that actually allowed African American writers to write for his paper. So you just shared with me that not a character, true hero in African American history. Thank you.
Thank you. And so J. Thomas,
T. Thomas
Fortune was one of the first African American scholars to really try to get people to think beyond the race paradigm and to understand that the economics at stake, and how when you move to that area, that it transcends race. So let you do the fourth person in this square of voices. But I do want to just quickly mention, it's very interesting that is where I think that's when the status quo in America gets most frightened, when we get beyond race and we start seeing the economic and human issues that really pull together the majority of Americans. Some people, now I don't know if Dr. Weems, if you have an opinion about this, some people say that's actually what got Dr. King killed, is that when he began to talk about the war in Vietnam, and so he started pulling together people across racial boundaries, the war in Vietnam, and then he started planning the Poor People's March on Washington, which transcended race. That's when he became, in some people's eyes, too dangerous. I don't know how accurate that history is, but I've heard that said. Let's go to the fact. Yeah, jump in. Yes. Okay.
I don't know if you want me to.
No, jump in. Yes, please. Yes. Come in on that now. Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, just as there was this earlier dichotomy between Booker T and W.B. Du Bois, when we move into the 1960s, you had a similar dichotomy between Dr. King and Malcolm X. And clearly at earlier points in their careers, they were at opposite ends of the spectrum. At one point when, Malcolm was talking about white devils and Dr. King was dreaming, they were viewed to be relatively harmless. But again, as both of these individuals evolved, and both of them at the time of their assassinations, they were increasingly focused on the importance of economics and how economics, in fact, influence what happened to African Americans. And that's what made them all the more dangerous. So yeah, that, what you shared, Pastor Johnson, that is indeed, what most people, view to be, correct.
Yeah,
Yes, Kai. Yes, no. Jump in, sir.
Yeah, so I was trying to hold my peace over here. So I was familiar with this character, and I find putting things in context, the time at which he's leading this discussion is really impressive. Like I want people hearing this to like think about what he was doing, and then to help you kind of contextualize it. One of the things when we started this podcast early that confused people is when you looked at even political figures like a Donald Trump. Sorry, folks. But he would have relationships, right? There were some African Americans that supported him that had a lot of money. He's done business deals. He's been around the world, but he was able to have these relationships because they had a certain amount of money, right? So we could communicate, we could be a partnership. There's things that we can do. But so at a certain point, your money can move you past some of the racial constructs that hold you back if you fight through them. But I think that sometimes that's the illusion we get lost in, right? So it's a twofold fight. But and behind all of this, I would ask hard questions about capitalism. Not that I want to get rid of capitalism, but I'm saying we have a system that is for profit. So if you can pay to play, you can get in the game despite your other affinity groups that you might be a part of. But we think just because somebody breaks through that they've automatically made it. But it is a combination of both race and class, right? So it's like the nature nurture arguments. We argue all the time that it's nature or it's nurture, but the truth is it's a messy blend of the two. But the racial constructs do, at the end of the day, I mean, I think most people would agree, the racial constructs inform or empower and allow the class structure or the economic policies that either make us or break us. So again, if people should really go back, pay attention to that, his thinking at that time of how this system was working is brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
And so ahead of his time,
Very much so. Very much so.
All right, Dr. Weems, and the fourth voice in this conversation.
The fourth voice in this debate really combines sort of African American history with the African American faith tradition. And this individual was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner.
Wow.
Henry McNeil Turner, just a little biographical background on Henry McNeil Turner. Turner, in fact, was born a free black in the 1830s in South Carolina. At this moment in time, if you were a quote unquote free black in America during the height of slavery, you pretty much had only two occupational options. You could either be a teacher or you could preacher. Turner chose the latter. He initially affiliated with the old Methodist Episcopal Church South. Later, during the Civil War, he pastored a church in Washington, D.C., an AME church, and he became very prominent in the AME church. After the Civil War, Henry McNeil Turner was involved with the Freedmen's Bureau. At one point in time, he was elected to the Georgia state legislature. But we know with Reconstruction ended sooner in some areas than in others. Turner was in, again, the Georgia state legislature. By the early 1870s, ex-Confederates had pretty much retaken control, of Georgia, and Turner and other blacks were forced out of politics. And during the 1870s, Turner really did a lot of very important missionary work for the AME church. And based upon those activities, by the 1880s, he had earned the honorific title of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. And 1883 represented a major turning point in the life and career of Henry McNeil Turner. in that year, the Supreme Court declared that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. A lot of people think about the Civil Rights Act, focuses on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was very similar to that later legislation. And in 1883, the Supreme Court declared that that was unconstitutional.
Wow.
And literally, Henry McNeil Turner just went off. He gave a speech after the Supreme Court decision saying that the Supreme Court decision pretty much absolved Black people of any allegiance to the United States. And he went so far to say that Black people need to just spit on the Constitution.
Wow.
Now, when you're talking about spitting on the U.S. Constitution, that represents your figurative or not literal renunciation of American citizenship. And literally for the rest of his career, and there's a sort of irony in this, is that I mentioned earlier that during the Civil War, Henry McNeil Turner had pastored an AME church in D.C. He actually urged Black people to enlist in the Civil War. Turner, in fact, was one of the first African-American chaplains in the U.S. military. But after 1883, his career and mindset did a complete 360. For the rest of his career, he was a strong advocate for African Americans to return to the African continent. And based upon the fact that Henry McNeil Turner was a prominent leader of the then largest African American denomination in this country, what he had to say, attracted a lot of attention. And a lot of people, again, we talk about, the whole Back to Africa impulse in American history. A lot of people have heard of, Marcus Garvey in this regard, but far fewer people have heard of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. And he, again, is another important fourth voice in this whole question of how Black people should respond to the failure of Reconstruction. Because Turner said, we just need to leave this country because there's no way because he became extremely pessimistic because he saw there was little chance for people of African descent to achieve any level of freedom, justice, and equality in America.
Wow. Feedback, panelists, feedback.
I think, when you hear these stories and, it's almost easy to forget that these are folks that some of whom grew up in slavery or barely free from slavery. And, we have this image of enslaved Black Americans, and they're largely uneducated and have such powerlessness, but they get an inch of room, and you see a sort of articulation and power that that they grasp and seek to create movements. And it's really remarkable because these are folks that society had largely oppressed and taken so much from, and yet they get an inch and they go as far as they can. And it's really quite amazing, the ingenuity and the drive from so many people.
Yes. Kai, Yolanda?
You're muted, Pastor Yo.
I like thinking about there's this saying that you've seen on social media, and it talks about that when this period was not that long ago. You know, we see it as the distant past, but I think there's some saying, and when Harriet was born, Thomas Jefferson was alive. When he died, that Reagan came along. So we're not talking about too far ago that we. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that I understand why we have not achieved the dream of king. Okay, we're not too far past all of these things that have actually occurred, and there's still residue from all of it. I'm so impressed, though. I get hairs that stand up on the back of my neck when I think about these people that were way before their times. And what would I do? Would I, if I had the opportunity, to be the unpopular voice of the time, to think it and keep it in my home, but not necessarily share it with the public? So just impressed.
Great. I am delighted with all mention of all these persons. Dr. Weems, I am planning to preach a little about George Washington Carver on Sunday, but I know his connection with Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee University, and the lab but just the work that those two men did there together. And then, of course, I'm astonished, shocked, but pleasantly surprised that you brought up Bishop Henry Neal Turner and his impact, Henry McNeil Turner and his impact and contributions and participation, particularly with the Methodist Church South and then into the AME Church and that whole transition and his prophetic presence. Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. Did you have another person you want to lift up to us?
Yeah, the final person I want to lift up from relative undeserved obscurity is someone that I tell my students is arguably the most underrated person in 20th century African American history.
Wow.
Most everyone is well aware of this individual whose name I'm going to reveal in a moment, his protege. His protege, in fact, was Thurgood Marshall. But the person I want to lift up, and he, again, is another one of our fraternity brothers, Pastor Johnson and Kai.
Okay.
Charles Hamilton Houston.
Wow.
Charles Hamilton Houston literally created the career of civil rights attorney. When he became dean of Howard Law School in 1929, he particular focus on making Howard the number one place for the training of civil rights attorneys. And one of his early proteges was Thurgood Marshall.
Wow.
And Charles Hamilton Houston, this was someone that was just totally committed to the cause. One of his favorite quotes was that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite. There was no middle ground in terms of what a lawyer should do in terms of how they interact with constituents in society. One of the reasons why Charles Hamilton Houston has fallen through the cracks of history is that he died in 1950, before the Brown decision. But in a very interesting way, Charles Hamilton Houston, before he died, literally predicted that, certain things, in fact, would happen in the realm of civil rights and the opening up of opportunities. And there's a very interesting quote, another quote attributed to Charles Hamilton Houston. And Charles Hamilton Houston was someone that was totally committed to the struggle. And his role in the struggle for Black liberation was through the law. And this was someone who spent 20 and 20, 21-hour days, pouring through law books, working to, bring down Jim Crow. And in the process of, again, this just extreme work ethic that Charles Hamilton Houston had, it took a toll on his health. And his doctor, literally told him that, man, you killing yourself with this, this work regimen that you have. And Charles Hamilton Houston's response to that was that, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees.
Live on my
and
knees.
Charles Hamilton,
Yes.
it's not hyperbole to say that this is someone who literally worked himself to death on behalf of the Black freedom struggle. So again, when we talk about, the heroes of African American history, Charles Hamilton Houston is definitely in the upper pantheon of this group, but for a variety of reasons, he's kind of fallen through the cracks.
Yes, he has. Yes, he has. So we should think of him in some way as the mentor of Thurgood Marshall.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. And Thurgood Marshall would tell you, that, yeah, this was my mentor. Because again, Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard literally created the occupation of civil rights attorney. And Thurgood Marshall turned out to be, the star pupil in this regard, if you will. But yeah, Thurgood Marshall learned everything he knew from Charles Hamilton Houston.
Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. All right. Those of you that are listening in, I want to give you a few moments. If you all want to ask Dr. Weems a question about history, just post that in the comments and we will get your question put up. And we definitely want to hear from you. As we're waiting for you to ask your question, I have a question for Dr. Weems, and I want to know, are you familiar with this book?
I've seen the book, but I have not read it. I'm familiar with the title. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I just want to lift that book up to our audience, to our virtual congregation. I've mentioned it several times. If you want to read a great book that uncovers some voices that we typically don't talk about, you've got to read this book. Dr. Weems, in this book, there's a lot of information on O.W. Gurley. And I don't know, O.W. Gurley is the gentleman who goes to Tulsa in 1905 and begins with his wealth, kind of is that catalyst behind the entire, what becomes what we know as Black Wall Street. That it was his money. He built a couple of hotels. He was doing some amazing stuff economically and financially that led to Black Wall Street. So those of you that want to know that, I find economic history of Black Wall Street and how it happened, this is a good book to get. As a matter of fact, 5 of the people who are covered in the book, who are 5 of the earliest extremely wealthy Black people in American history, most of them are interconnected. They're interconnected. Their stories interweave, and which produces Black Wall Street. And then, of course, part of that story that I love to tell is that when the riot happened and Tulsa Greenwood was destroyed, some of the Black people left there and moved to Harlem, New York in the early 1900s and begin and become the financial base for what becomes the Harlem Renaissance. It's a fascinating read. So I want to encourage those of you that have not read it to get it. And if you want to, this lifts up some different voices as well. Speaking of that, as we're waiting to see if we have any questions from our audience, Philip Oliver says, them alpha men were no jokes, and they still aren't. Not all great men are alphas, but all alphas are great men. I just thought I would. That's not in the Bible. I know some people might be looking in the Bible for like, where is that in the Bible? That's not in the Bible. But what is your Can you give us your quick economic assessment of what happened in Tulsa? How did Black people 50 years removed from slavery build that kind of wealth? And as a note, it didn't just happen there. That happened. There were multiple communities that were built up that built their own wealth that were destroyed. But what happened there, Dr. Weems, and how did they do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it speaks to a larger issue of looking at those first couple generations after the end of slavery, in that we saw most ex-enslaved people enter quote unquote freedom with little more than just the clothes on their backs. They had little, if any, capital. But within a couple generations, we saw African Americans, building educational institutions, building churches, building businesses. And what happened in Tulsa was just an important, manifestation of this, on one level, it's, and again, as a historian, I don't, talk a lot about miracles in the context of history.
Right.
But when you look at, the reality of the time and what people were able to accomplish, again, it's beyond extraordinary. And quite frankly, it was an issue of people understanding the importance of pooling their resources. Because if you have a community that's committed to pooling their resources, you can, accomplish a lot of amazing things. And again, mentioned, we saw this going on in other parts of the country where people were able to pool their resources. One could argue very clearly that enforced segregation created a situation where if Black people didn't pool their resources, then they would, become extinct. But again, that sense of pride and that sense of community was one that, really was in the forefront. And quite frankly, when we look at the white response to what African Americans were doing, there was a real sense of jealousy, amazement, because, whites, held the notion that these are inferior people that, really can't do much. And when we saw, Black people, building a prosperous community, it's like, what's going on here? So again, it's a very, complex story, but, the bottom line was that resolve for people to pool their resources.
Yes, as a matter of fact, you just hit on it. When I think about Tulsa, Greenwood, and all the communities, Rosewood, Florida, there were multiple communities, Wilmington, North Carolina, where there had been built up a strong Black community where financial economic resources that were destroyed by white mobs. And then I hear the criticism today, Dr. Weems, when people say Black people need to get off the dole. They need to stop depending on the government. They're lazy. They lack ingenuity. They lack creativity. And to hear Black people agree with that is just so heartbreaking and is so wrong and is so not true. And one of my first responses is, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street? So if that's true, and as you say, they left plantations with nothing but the clothes on their backs, which were barely any clothes at all, no shoes on their feet, own nothing. And within 56 years, and you were right, we don't talk about miracles in terms of academic history, but for all practical purposes, it was miraculous what happened. It was absolutely miraculous. But it happened because people were pooling their resources. I've heard people talk about how many times the Black dollar turned over in Black Wall Street. And so the money was circulating in the community. Absolutely. There's one question here from Philip Oliver. He says, are there any businesses from Tulsa Times or any other communities still in business today? So are any other
Well,
businesses?
one of the sort of tragedies when we talk about Tulsa, and this has implications for other cities, including Wichita, was that what the white mobs weren't able to because a lot of people don't realize that black people in Tulsa rebuilt Greenwood
Yeah.
after the destruction of 1921. But what whites weren't able to destroy in the early 20th century, the building of interstate highways that went right through the Greenwood community, ultimately, displaced and really curtailed a lot of significant African American development. Because one of the things I learned in my research on Wichita and in talking to people about local history was that the building of I-135, which went
Yes.
right through the African American community here, had a devastating effect on African businesses. A lot of the businesses that were displaced in the building of I-135 were never, reestablished in other locales. And this was something that literally went on across the country. There's not
Across the
a
country.
city in America where black people live, interstates did not go directly through pre-existing black neighborhoods. And one of the consequences of that was the destruction of pre-existing black black business communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for. As a matter of fact, that's one of the untold stories when we talk about the devastate. When you go to you go to almost any city in America, and you go to the different parts of the city. You go to the city where a lot of black folks live. You go to the part of the city where a lot of white folks live, and people look at the disparity, and they think the only thing they point out, they think that it's a reflection of different values, or it's a reflection of laziness and all the other things that black folks get accused of. And there is no acknowledgement of that kind of history, how interstates and highways were built through black communities that displaced people and were never replaced in another place. And then we can get into the GI Bill and talk about all the other things that have happened, redlining, things that happened that created poverty pockets in cities that black folks are still trying to overcome to this day. This has been awesome, Dr. Weems. I want to give a chance and just I asked Kai, Kyle, and Yolanda to each list a person that they would like to lift up as a voice, an obscure voice. So, Yolanda, you want to go first?
Sure. I want to highlight Claudette Colvin. So before Rosa, there was Sister Claudette. At the age of 15, 9 months to about a year before Rosa Parks ever refused to give up her seat, Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat. So at 15 years old, one of her quotes, I want to get it right, she said, "History had me glued to my seat." So at the age of 15, she knew the impact of the decision that she was making not to get up out of her chair. Now, why didn't she become the face of the civil rights movement? It's because she didn't fit the bill. 9 months later, when Rosa Parks did the same thing, she fit the mold. She was educated. She was an administrator in the NAACP, and she was formally educated. So all of the organizations decided to use Rosa, well, not necessarily use Rosa. Yeah, I'm going to say use Rosa as the face and her circumstances. She was tired that day and refused to give up. But we very seldomly talk about the young 15-year-old teenage mother who did exactly the same thing 9 months prior. They didn't really highlight her very much because at that time she was considered uppity, but she remained a convicted felon for 66 years. Recently here in December of 2021, where a young African American judge said that he was born for such a time as this. He was born to become a judge, to exonerate and close her books.
Wow.
What's also very strange about what irritates me about her story is she was put on indefinite probation. So basically, all of her life, even though it did have an end point, she was never told that her probation was over. So her entire life, she's 82 years old now, I think, and she's lived her whole life as a convicted felon because she refused to give up her seat.
Good one, Pastor Yolanda.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Well, sir.
Okay. I had to find a better picture for you, but good story. Good story. Good story. Good story. All right. Kai.
Sorry, I had to unmute. So I wouldn't say this is an oppressed voice per se. The people may not have heard of him. Dr. James Cone, Black theologian, Black liberation theology, wrote over 12 books. Just a titan of a person as far as holding people around accountability, around ideas of justice and what Jesus would do with justice. Strong voice for the oppressed people and the voice of oppressed people through the gospel. If you're a little bit of a Bible nerd or just go read some of his work. It is eye-opening. It will definitely challenge you. And one of the things I like about him the most, he went to task with Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of our intellectual theological giant here in the States, and he took him to task. And I don't say that as if to like brag about that, but he really went to hold him accountable about being active and really living out our faith and what that looks like. So I appreciate him for that. He was a peppery guy. He mellowed a little bit over time, but just a wonderful person who wasn't afraid to make you think.
Did you say peppery?
Peppery.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, he was. As a matter of fact,
he looks very calm and no, Dr. Cone gets together.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, his first book was Black Theology and Black Power, which was very peppery. And then he came back and wrote a Black Theology of Liberation, where he toned it down some and wrote more in a white Western approach to systematic theology. But I actually my first intro to theological studies class with Dr. Schubert Ogden, we read Dr. James Cone, Black Theology and Black Power. And so that was a lively environment, because in the book he says things like, so when they do systematic theology, you talk about who God is, who Jesus is, Holy Spirit, ecclesiology, understanding of the church, the mission of the church. And Dr. Cone would say, we don't listen to Westernized European ideas about Jesus. For us, Jesus is the person that helps us get white folks off our back. Now, and by the way, I said I am not promoting that. I'm quoting Dr. Cone. I don't want nobody going back saying, did you hear Pastor Johnson say that Jesus is the person that helps us get white folks?
Own it, Robert. Come on.
Quoting someone else. But absolutely, indeed. Pastor Kyle.
Yeah, and the person I wanted to highlight, it certainly is an unknown. Malcolm X. I just, for me, I'll tell you my story. I grew up, and this is fascinating to me because I don't know how this narrative is created, but I grew up where Martin Luther King was the good social rights leader, civil rights leader, and Malcolm X was the bad one.
Yeah.
And I can't even say where that came from, what I heard along the way to make me think that, but that's the narrative. And so I had taken that for years. And then a few years ago, I was listening in on a podcast done by, I think, 4 Black women. That I was not the target audience of this podcast at all, but I'm like trying to hear voices that are different than my own. And
you
so
can embrace your inner Black woman, Pastor.
Absolutely. All right. All right. Thank you. I need that permission. So there was an episode on Malcolm X, and I thought, this is interesting. I don't really know anything about him. And so And the way they talked about him was just fascinating to me because they had such high regard for him. And they were talking about, growing up. And one of them was saying, we had a bookshelf with one book on it, and it was Malcolm X's autobiography. And she was saying, like, she read it when she was 12. And they all sort of agreed with this, like that the autobiography of Malcolm X was like this huge thing for them personally. And so I got that from the library, and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I was fascinated by the complexity, and agree or disagree with various aspects of him. But he was certainly instrumental in unashamed Black pride, and knowing that he was being misunderstood, and sort of ends his autobiography with this recognition, very real recognition of people are going to paint me this way. And what was fascinating to me too is, he had spent time in prison, prior to coming into the Islamic faith. But after that, as far as I'm aware, he was never arrested. But Martin Luther King was constantly arrested. But we have this hugely negative. I think I would have assumed that Malcolm X was constantly imprisoned, that he was this violent man, but he wasn't. And obviously his rhetoric was over the top, and all that. But I don't know. It was just, so for me personally, Malcolm X is somebody that I truly did not know until a few years ago, and it was just it was just really important for me to learn and to understand more, and especially the complexity of civil rights leaders like him.
As a matter of fact, like so many of our African American personalities, what we know about them are merely caricatures, not true representations. And so it's important that we go back and we dig that history up. That's why we're so glad, Dr. Weems, that you came on tonight. I want to end and just mention three people real quickly. One person that I like, well, one, let me mention this. Kai mentioned Dr. James Cone, and Kyle mentioned Malcolm X. And I want to say that Dr. James Cone wrote an amazing book called A Dream or a Nightmare, where he basically talks about Dr. King and Malcolm X, and talked about what Dr. Weems said, talked about how they had begun to come together from opposite ends of the pendulum. They had started to come together. And it's a fascinating read. And then, of course, Dr. Cone talks about how we can't be a healthy Black community, and America can't be healthy unless we embrace the wisdom of both Martin and Malcolm. It's a fascinating read that I recommend to everyone. I want to mention quickly three people, and I'm not going to I just want to mention them very quickly. But one person is not an African American, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because of his impact on world history and his role he played. He was, of course, martyred in Germany because of his he was one of the few clergy who took a stand against Hitler and was executed. But he actually came to Union Theological Seminary in New York, where Dr. James Cone and Reinhold Niebuhr were. He came there and studied for a year. And then during that time, he actually attended church at the Great Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. And it was while he was at that church that he said that the spirituals were some of the richest spiritual blessing that he had ever received. And he left America, by the way, giving a clear criticism of the white evangelical church. So long before deconstruction, long before Trump, long before all this stuff that we're doing now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw as early as the early 1900s the danger of what was happening in the white evangelical church. That was the only segment of the church that he criticized when he left here to go back to Germany to take his stance against Hitler. That's an amazing story. The second person, very quickly, is this lady.
Come through with the Bonhoeffer. You get points.
And then this person right here, Indisha Ida Mae Holland, who was a citizen in Greenwood, Mississippi, who, and this is a fascinating story, when the civil rights workers and the voting rights workers came from North to help Black folks register in Mississippi in the summer of '64. Ida Mae, as they called her, Cat, was living in Greenwood and was actually a prostitute. And the story, she tells this story in a documentary that I enjoyed, that when these young guys showed up, that she was hitting on them because she was trying to turn tricks with them. She was actually walking behind them trying to do business. And one of them invited her into the office space, and she walked in and says that it changed her life because she had never seen Black people so professional, so organized. And she asked, how can I get involved? She gets involved to recruit Black people to register to vote. Her reputation in the city is so bad that as she's going door to door, she said that the police would pull up behind her and said, Ida Mae, what are you doing out here knocking on these people?
It's the journey. It's, you know.
Ida Mae, take your behind home. Leave these people alone. What are you doing out here? But she goes on and earns up, and the civil rights, getting involved in the civil rights movement changed her life. She goes on to the University of Minnesota and earns a PhD, and then begins writing and ends up like having a play that she wrote that was that debuted in London. Just a fascinating story of turnaround, a miraculous Dr. Weems turnaround story. That's just absolutely astonishing.
Ida Mae.
Ida Mae, Cat.
That is a story that would fit right in the Bible.
It would.
Right?
You're right.
Yes.
You're right.
Yes.
100%.
That is a biblical story.
I wanted to make a joke about welcome to Bible study, but honestly,
Exactly.
this is exactly what would fit in the Bible.
Exactly.
Pastor Johnson, don't you take that to the pulpit? Don't you take that story to the pulpit?
Hey, I'm doing it. Just send out an email to all St. Mark's members and warn them and say, I'm just giving y'all a heads up that he's coming with something weird on Sunday. And then
Brother Rod Holt, if you're watching, please help.
Get to me before Sunday. And then, of course, my last person I want to mention, I can't have this conversation with her Dr. Weems.
Yes.
This is my favorite American. And I know everybody knows Harriet Tubman, but there's so much more to her story than most people don't know. So much more to her story. Just a phenomenal soul. If you don't believe in miracles, you need to go read Black history. You need to go read the history of America and see all the amazing things that people did with no resources and living in conditions that most of us would consider hopeless today. Just amazing lives. And so it's a joy to uncover those lives. All right, we're done. It's 8:37. We've got to close. I do want to mention just very quickly, and we don't have time to talk about it, but I do want to just show folks the
yes, ma'am, Miss Janice. Yes, ma'am.
There it is. And you can
pre-order now.
You can pre-order now. And get a copy of it. And I hope St. Mark members will pre-order and drive. So by the time we get to the actual release date on April 19th, when the hard copy actually when it's actually on sale in bookstores, that we'll be well on our way to having many sales and impacting people's lives and our church and community.
So are you not going to share what the proceeds of this book actually supports?
So St. Mark, in the contract that I have with the publisher, St. Mark gets 50% of all book sales. So when you buy a book, you're also supporting your church. So that's an addition. That's an even better reason to buy the book. Even if you don't read the book because you think I'm crazy, buy the book to support your church.
Amen.
Blessing. Dr. Weems, you are a jewel. Are you a blessing?
Always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure.
I wouldn't say you are an obscure voice, but your voice is way underappreciated, way underexposed. And so I hope that tonight will help. But I hope that you and I and Yolanda and Kyle and Kai will do some future stuff together to continue to expose people to your intellectual brilliance, and you'll continue to share your history and your wealth of knowledge and information. All right, folks. Dr. Weems, thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank
We
you
will
for
follow you later. Kai, Kyle, and Yolanda, God bless you all. Have a
okay.
good night. All right. Good night.
Congratulations again, Pastor Johnson. And Janice Elmore, yes, my sister, ain't I a woman too?
Ain't
And
I a
you
woman too?
are
Sojourner
holding
Truth.
it down. Yes, and you're holding it down in your own right. We're so proud of your work with the United Methodist Women.
Yes, 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 yes. All
Have
right,
a blessed
folks.
night.
God bless.